There comes a point in every legend's life when the spotlight feels heavier than ever. For Brian May, that moment arrived when the very thing that defined him, the hand that gave life to Queen's greatest anthems, suddenly betrayed him. At 78, the man who once commanded stadiums full of voices was forced to face a question no one ever imagines asking. Can you still be yourself when your body begins to fail you? Late in 2024, Brian May's world shook with a health scare that could have ended everything. Doctors called it minor, but there was nothing minor about waking up and realizing your left arm, the arm that built decades of music history, simply wouldn't respond. For a guitarist, it was more than a medical issue. It was an identity crisis. Would the sound that carried him across half a century of fame ever return? And yet, just when the silence threatened to take over, he found a way to remind the world and himself that his story wasn't finished. At Coachella 2025, the desert lights flickered, the crowd roared, and Brian May walked on stage, guitar in hand. It wasn't nostalgia, it was defiance. It was proof that even at 78 he could still make the earth shake with a single note. This isn't just a story about music. It's about resilience, about the fight to keep going when everything in your body tells you to stop. And once you hear what happened to Brian May at 78, you may never listen to Queen the same way again. It started quietly, almost too quietly. No flashing lights, no drama, just a strange feeling that something wasn't right. One morning in late 2024, Brian May reached for his guitar, and the left arm that had carried him through half a century of music suddenly refused to cooperate. At first, it seemed like fatigue, maybe just a bad night's sleep. But the truth was much darker. He was experiencing a minor stroke, and in that moment, the unthinkable became real. For a man like Brian, whose very identity is tied to the movement of his fingers, that loss was devastating. Imagine being the architect of some of the most iconic guitar riffs in history, only to find your own body turning against you. He admitted later that fear took over instantly. Not fear of dying, fear of never playing again. Doctors rushed him to Frimley Hospital, blue lights flashing, the urgency of the moment undeniable. Tests confirmed the stroke was small but serious enough to rob him of full control. He was alive, yes, but the question now was whether the Red Special, his hand-built guitar and lifelong companion, would ever sing under his fingers again. Friends, family, and fans rallied around him, but inside Brian wrestled with a storm few could see. For someone who had already faced a heart attack, surgeries, and other health scares, this was different. This was personal. The guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was the extension of who he was. To lose that was to lose himself. And yet, even in those first uncertain hours, a spark of defiance remained. Brian wasn't ready to let go. The stroke had stolen control, but it hadn't stolen his spirit. What came next would test his patience, his resilience, and his faith that music could still flow through his veins, even when his body faltered. If you're finding this story interesting, stay with me, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. For Brian May, the 2024 stroke wasn't the first time life tried to strip away the music. His journey has been marked by more than applause and standing ovations. It has been punctuated by brushes with mortality that would have silenced a lesser man. To understand the weight of his most recent scare, you have to look back at the long battle he's been fighting with his own body. In 2020, Brian shocked the world when he revealed he had suffered a heart attack. It wasn't just a fleeting episode. Doctors discovered his arteries were dangerously clogged, leaving him just a hair's breadth away from disaster. He admitted that the pain was so intense, he thought the end had come. Surgery followed, and while doctors patched him up with stents to keep his heart beating, the recovery was grueling. For a man who lived for the adrenaline of live performance, being told to slow down was a punishment in itself. But the heart attack wasn't the only blow. Just months before, Brian found himself in agony after what sounded like a harmless bit of gardening. A torn gluteal muscle left him barely able to walk, and the injury spiraled into complications that nearly crippled him. Add in eye surgery, bouts of sciatica, and years of wear and tear from life on the road, and it's no wonder Brian has often joked that he feels like a patched-up old car barely holding together. Yet behind those jokes was a man who refused to surrender. Each time his body faltered, Brian turned the setback into fuel. Fans would see him return to the stage, guitar in hand, with that same wild mane of hair and that unmistakable smile. He seemed indestructible, as though no amount of pain or procedure could keep him away from the music. But in private, he admitted that these close calls changed him. They reminded him how fragile even the strongest lives can be. They forced him to treasure every concert, every recording session, every quiet moment with family. And most of all, they set the stage for the terrifying realization in 2024 that this time the thing at risk wasn't his strength or mobility. It was the very hand that carried his legacy, and that realization would shape everything that followed. For someone like Brian May, recovery was never going to mean lying still and waiting. Yet after the stroke, that's exactly what doctors demanded. No travel, no driving, no sudden exertion. Even the simple act of raising his heart rate was deemed too risky. To the outside world, it might have looked like a forced vacation. To Brian, it felt like being chained. The man who once filled stadiums with thunderous chords suddenly found himself measuring out his days in quiet moments, short walks around the countryside, cups of tea, gentle exercises to coax his arm back into obedience. His doctors had been clear. Push too hard, and the risk of another episode would loom. But patience was never Brian's strongest trait. He admitted that his greatest challenge wasn't physical pain, but learning how to sit still, how to accept slowness without losing himself. At home, Anita Dobson became his anchor. She spoke openly about how they adjusted their lives together, cooking side by side, enjoying evenings without the rush of schedules, rediscovering the small pleasures of domestic life. The man who once conquered the world with Queen now took pride in perfecting roasted chestnuts in the kitchen. To some, it might have seemed ordinary. For Brian, it was survival. But make no mistake, the restrictions weighed heavily. Every time he reached for his guitar, there was a hesitation, a flicker of fear that his arm might betray him again. Could he still play the solos exactly as fans remembered them? Could he trust his own body to deliver? Rehabilitation became as much about rebuilding confidence as rebuilding muscle. Still, there were victories. Slowly, the left hand responded. Slowly, the Red Special, the guitar he built with his father when he was just a teenager, began to sing again. Every chord struck was more than music. It was a declaration that he wasn't finished. And while the world waited quietly to see if he would ever return to the stage, Brian May was already preparing for the moment when he could show them he was still standing. Because for Brian, recovery wasn't about rest. It was about proving that even at 78, the fight inside him burned brighter than the setbacks around him. For months, Brian May kept his recovery quiet, leaving fans guessing whether they'd ever see him on stage again. Then, without warning, the silence shattered under the desert lights of Coachella 2025. No one expected him there. No one imagined that a 78-year-old rock icon who had just endured a stroke would step out in front of one of the most demanding crowds in the world. And yet, he did. The moment arrived during Benson Boone's set. The young star was deep into his performance when the unmistakable figure appeared, mane of silver hair glowing under the stage lights, Red Special strapped across his shoulder. At first, the audience froze, almost disbelieving. Then came the roar, a sound so deafening it nearly drowned out the opening chords of Bohemian Rhapsody. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was a living reminder of why Queen's music endures across generations. As Brian struck the legendary solo, every note rang out like a victory cry. There was no hesitation in his hands, no sign of weakness. The very arm that had failed him months before now moved with precision and power. Fans wept openly, phones raised high, capturing a moment they knew was history. For Brian, it was more than a performance. It was redemption. All the sleepless nights, the doubts, the slow exercises at home had built to this single moment. He wasn't there for money or headlines, or even legacy. He was there to prove to himself, and to the millions watching, that he still belonged on the stage. When the final note faded into the night sky, the applause didn't stop. Younger fans who barely knew Queen stood shoulder to shoulder with older fans who had lived through the band's golden years. For a brief moment, there was no gap between past and present, no difference between youth and age. There was only music, and the man who refused to let it be taken away. That night at Coachella wasn't just a comeback, it was a declaration. Brian may have scars, but he is far from finished. And in that desert, under the glow of the stage, he reminded the world that even legends can rise again when everyone least expects it. Away from the spotlight, Brian May's world looks very different at 78. The man who once spent nights in hotel rooms, airplanes, and arenas now finds comfort in something much quieter: home. After decades of chaos, he's embraced a life that feels almost ordinary. Though for Brian, nothing is ever truly ordinary. At the heart of this new chapter is his wife, Anita Dobson. Their bond, forged through decades of love and trials, has deepened in the wake of his health scares. Anita has been more than a partner. She's been his steadying force, reminding him to slow down when his instincts tell him to push forward. She's spoken about how they've rebuilt their days together, sharing meals, tending to the garden, cooking simple dishes like chestnuts roasted over the fire. These moments may seem small compared to the roar of a stadium, but to Brian they've become treasures. Then there's the countryside. Brian has always been a man of science and nature, and in these later years he's leaned into that side of himself. Long walks with Anita, quiet evenings surrounded by wildlife, and his tireless advocacy for animals have given him a new kind of fulfillment. He's particularly passionate about protecting badgers and foxes, often using his platform to raise awareness and fight for their survival. To some, it might seem like a surprising passion for a rock legend. To those who know him, it's just another way his heart speaks through action. Of course, music hasn't left him. Even on his quieter days, the Red Special is never far from reach. He still experiments, still records ideas, still finds joy in the feel of strings under his fingers. But unlike before, music now shares space with other passions: astrophysics, photography, and his work as an author. These pursuits remind fans that Brian May is not just a guitarist, but a thinker, a creator, and a man determined to leave a legacy that stretches far beyond the stage. At 78, Brian doesn't measure his worth by the number of concerts or the size of the crowds. He measures it in moments: the laughter of friends, the warmth of family, the satisfaction of knowing that even in rest, he's still living with purpose. And while the world may always remember him with a guitar in hand, Brian himself is finding joy in simply being present, alive, and unshaken by the challenges he's faced. Whenever a legend like Brian May faces health struggles, speculation always follows. Fans can't help but wonder, is this the beginning of the end, or just another chapter in a career that refuses to close? At 78, Brian finds himself surrounded by both rumors and expectations, each pulling in a different direction. Some fans are convinced Queen will never embark on another massive world tour. After all, the physical toll of long flights, endless rehearsals, and high-energy shows is staggering, even for younger performers. Doctors have already urged him to avoid overexertion, and Brian himself has admitted that his health has forced him to reconsider what touring really means. The image of him running across a stage night after night might be behind him, but others point to his Coachella performance as proof that he isn't done yet. That brief appearance reignited hopes of future shows, perhaps smaller, more selective appearances where the pressure is lower but the impact remains huge. Could he return for another Queen plus Adam Lambert tour? Could there be one final farewell concert, carefully planned to give fans closure while protecting his health? Those questions remain unanswered, and Brian, ever the perfectionist, isn't rushing to provide clarity. There are also whispers of new projects, collaborations with younger artists, unreleased material from Queen's vaults, even scientific work that he may want to publish. Brian has always lived with one foot in music and the other in science, and those dual passions mean his future doesn't have to rely on exhausting tours. He could easily pivot to creating, mentoring, or surprising fans with smaller scale but deeply meaningful releases. Of course, rumors about his health continue to swirl. Every time he skips a public event, speculation arises. Every candid photo sparks debate. Is he slowing down, or is he simply enjoying life out of the spotlight? Brian himself has been open about his limits, but he's also been clear about one thing: he doesn't intend to disappear. The truth is, no one knows exactly what Brian May's future holds, not even Brian himself. What's certain is that his story isn't over. Whether it's another stage appearance, a surprise album, or simply more time spent protecting wildlife and enjoying the countryside, Brian May continues to live on his own terms, and that, perhaps, is the most rock and roll decision of all. When people talk about Brian May, they don't just talk about a guitarist. They talk about a scientist, an activist, a husband, and a survivor. But no matter how many titles he carries, one name is always tied to his story: Freddie Mercury. As Queen's guitarist, Brian created the sound that wrapped itself around Freddie's voice. Together, they weren't just a band, they were a force of nature. Freddie brought the fire, Brian brought the thunder, and together they built songs that became immortal. When Freddie passed, Brian admitted the silence that followed was unbearable. He once said it felt like the lights went out, and for years he wasn't sure if Queen had a future at all. And yet his legacy today is inseparable from Freddie's. Every time Brian walks on stage, every time the opening notes of Bohemian Rhapsody echo through the air, fans don't just hear music, they feel Freddie's presence. It's why Brian pushes himself even now, despite age and health scares. Part of him is still carrying his friend, still keeping that fire alive for audiences who never got to see Freddie in his prime. Of course, Brian's contributions extend far beyond Queen. His PhD in astrophysics, his passion for animal rights, and his countless creative projects have proven he is more than a guitarist. But ask any fan what Brian's greatest legacy is, and the answer will always circle back to the bond he shared with Freddie Mercury, a bond that time, loss, and even death could never erase. At 78, Brian May's story matters because it shows us that greatness isn't just measured in what you achieve alone, but in the way you honor those you've lost. His resilience, his return to the stage, his refusal to give up, all of it carries Freddie's shadow, reminding us that legends don't vanish, they live on in the hands of those who refuse to stop playing. Brian May's journey at 78 isn't just about surviving health scares, it's about proving that passion doesn't fade with age, and that even when life takes away strength, it can't take away spirit. From the stroke that nearly silenced him to the roar of Coachella, where he showed the world he wasn't finished, Brian has reminded us what resilience really looks like. His story is more than music. It's about refusing to surrender, finding joy in small moments, and showing that legacy is built in how you rise after every fall. If Brian's journey moved you, make sure to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this that you won't want to miss.